Sounds like we're live. So good morning, everyone. For the record, Tyler Klimas, Executive Director of the Cannabis Compliance Board. Today is Thursday, June 18th. The time is 9:01 a.m. This is the time and place for a workshop with the founding three members of the Cannabis Compliance Board regarding proposed regulations 1 through 15 of the Nevada Cannabis Compliance Regulations, NCCR. I would like to welcome Chairman Michael Douglas and Member Jerry Merritt, who join us here in Las Vegas, as well as Member Dennis Nylander, who joins us by phone. This workshop has been properly noticed in accordance with the public meeting law. So we'll begin today with a public comment period in compliance with Governor Sisolak's Emergency Directive number 6, dated March 22nd, 2020. This workshop is being conducted by means of electronic communication. Public comments were asked to be submitted online before 5 p.m. Pacific yesterday to be read into the record today. Any comments received from that point on or during the meeting today will be posted online in their entirety following the workshop. We encourage any interested member of the public to submit comments today by email to regulations@ccb.nv.gov. So with that, we will start the public comment period. I'm going to read 10 submissions into the record. There were 2 additional submissions before 5 p.m. They were lengthy, technical submissions, so we are going to post those online following this meeting. So I'm going to read the remaining 10 in the order which they were received. First one comes from Jerry Velarde. He's the president of Evergreen Organics. I feel terpene testing for edibles and topicals should be changed to be optional for. We have conducted thousands of tests, and terpenes rarely show up in the edible products. Mandating that tests for edibles is truly a waste of time, money, and lab effort. One point would be is that terpenes are what distinct the indica, sativa, and hybrid in cannabis, and yet some producers are false advertising and misleading consumers when they identify their edible as sativa or indica. If there are no terpenes, all you will have is THC and or CBD. Consumers flock to an indica or sativa label, which if there are no terpene cannabinoids in the product, then all they are really purchasing is a product with THC. Number 2, I would like to recommend that we use this opportunity to look to simplifying labels. In my opinion, the current label requirements are too detailed, and simplifying the labels would be better for producers, but ultimately consumers, as it would be easy for them to decipher. In my opinion, labels should only be required to contain the following: total THC content, total CBD content, serving size, if applicable, terpenes, if applicable, net weight, production run number, expiration date, ingredients, allergens, plus or minus 15% disclosure, producer name and license number, cannabis solvent disclosure, if applicable, all required warning statements. There's also an example of a current label here you'll be able to view online. Number 3, I would like someone to discuss with producers the need of scoring and demarking servings of THC for edibles greater than 10 milligrams. I feel scoring is what will break down a serving size, and to have to place a 10 milligram marker on each seems redundant. For example, a 100 milligram brownie with scoring will break into 10 units. Number 4, metric. Distributors should be exclusively responsible for inputting their routes, driver, and vehicle information into metric. Right now, that responsibility falls on the producers and cultivators. However, the distributors often change drivers after pickup or take routes as not depicted on the manifest. This compliance risk is not fair to the wholesalers. It is our duty to input and our liability if it is not followed by the distributors. Number 5, the package weight entries on metric manifest is redundant and unnecessary. It is not useful to deterring theft because the internal package contents are what matters. The tallying and entry of a shipment weight is excessive, causing extra and unnecessary work, and is hugely inefficient. If we are all able to eliminate redundancy and reduce costs, products can be more affordable, and we can actually compete with illegal dealers in the market. The illegal market is sophisticated and could be selling millions per month in illegal and non-tax tested products. Please see this particular account that is constantly promoting the sale of illegal brands. We have several accounts we're familiar with, and we'd be more than happy to share them in an effort to curb the the illegal presence in Nevada. I hope you find this information useful and would welcome the opportunity to have the department refer to us as a resource. Submission 2. This comes from Dale Walsh of Walsh Certified Consultants. To whom it may concern, in accordance with Cannabis Compliance Board Regulatory Workshop Agenda dated June 12, 2020, Walsh Certified Consultants presents this public comment on the subject proposed regulations. This comment refers to the paragraph at 8.015, subsection 3B, which states 8.015, restrictions on access to facility and persons authorized on premises. Location of cannabis growing at facility. Subsection 3, each cannabis cultivation facility shall ensure that any cannabis growing at the cannabis cultivation facility, subsection B, unless the cannabis cultivation facility cultivates cannabis outdoors, does not emit a strong odor that is detectable from outside the cannabis cultivation facility. The term odor or strong odor is not defined in Regulation 1. Since these terms are very subjective, the enforcement of 8.015, subsection 3B, would be based on opinion and not objective facts. To address this issue, the City of Las Vegas Odor Standard and Testing Protocol for Measuring Exterior Odors at Medical Marijuana Cultivation and/or Production Facilities, enclosed, was written. It is required for cannabis cultivation and production facilities under the City of Las Vegas Ordinance 9.40.040, Medical Marijuana Odor Nuisances. WCCI recommends that a definition of odor be placed in Regulation 1 to clarify and assist in the enforcement of 8.015, subsection 3B. The following would be appropriate. 1.132, odor defined. Odor means volatilized chemical compounds that are generally found in low concentrations that humans can perceive by their sense of smell. A strong odor, as it relates to volatile chemical compounds associated with cannabis, means detectable terpenes as identified outside a cannabis cultivation or production facility using the City of Las Vegas Odor Standard and Testing Protocol for Measuring Exterior Odors at Medical Marijuana Cultivation and/or Production Facilities. Thank you for considering this public comment. Should you have any questions or comments regarding this letter, please do not hesitate to call. Included is the Odor Standard and Testing Protocol from the City of Las Vegas. Submission 3 comes from Josh Kasoff. He is the Secretary of Nevada NORML. To whom this may concern, I'm Josh Kasoff, a journalist and Secretary for Nevada NORML. Over the past few months, I've been producing a series called Irregulators, in which I present evidence for our normal news segments about the scandals and misdeeds surrounding Department of Taxation, including but not limited to the strictness and costliness of the marijuana agent card when compared to other states, the almost endless amount of lawsuits the department has been involved in, and the questionable nature in which cannabis cultivation licenses were allocated. However, they're notoriously non-transparent when it comes to their operations and unwilling to speak with the media on most occasions. Because I believe in fair and honest journalism and not letting irregulators just serve as a smear piece of the Department of Taxation, I've attempted multiple times to contact the DOT to allow them to fairly respond to the evidence I've presented, yet have never received a response once. My question for the meeting on June 18th is this: will the newly formed Cannabis Compliance Board be more transparent about their operations and open to speak with and inform the media and respond to their questions on their operations instead of cannabis consumers, employees finding out about their operations through exposés done by the Nevada Current? As a cannabis consumer and employee affairs reporter, I find it of the utmost importance that the regulatory body is willing to speak with the media so those consumers and employees stay informed. Thank you and have a great day. I'm looking forward to the meeting on the 18th. Submission number 4. This comes from Randall Query. He is the Director of Government Relations for A2LA. Dear Chair and Cannabis Compliance Board members, I am Randy Query, Director of Government Relations for the American Association for Laboratory Accreditation. I've been involved with laboratory accreditation for well over 2 decades. On behalf of the A2LA, I am commenting on the proposed Regulation 11, Cannabis Testing Facilities. By way of background, A2LA is a nonprofit accreditation body with over 3,700 actively accredited certificates representing all 50 states, including over 60 organizations accredited for cannabis testing. We have been granting accreditation to testing laboratories in various industries since 1979. The criteria forming the basis for our laboratory accreditation program is ISO IEC 17025, General Requirements for the Competence of Testing and Calibration Laboratories. We ourselves, as an accreditation body, have been evaluated against rigorous standards in providing this accreditation service and are recognized globally as an international laboratory accreditation cooperation, recognized accreditation body. In establishing a state cannabis program, testing and the ensuing test results are critical to the program. Regular laboratory assessments leading to accreditation will provide the users of the test reports with confidence that the data is backed by a quality management system, technically competent testing, qualified personnel, and the use of appropriate facilities and testing equipment. We strongly support your regulations in requiring ISO IEC 17025 accreditation through an ILAC signatory as required in Section 11.025. However, we are respectfully requesting clear language specific to Section 11.020 that now reads, number 2, each cannabis testing facility that claims to be accredited must provide the board with copies of each annual inspection report from the accrediting organization, including, without limitation, any deficiencies identified in and any corrections made in response to the report. In general, the current practice is not to conduct annual on-site inspections. What is expected scope of work for these assessments? That is, are they to include an assessment to all of the criteria and all testing each year? Are the accreditation bodies to conduct full on-site assessments of the management system requirements and all of the testing capabilities? To ensure a consistent assessment approach by all accreditation bodies, we encourage that this be defined. We would be pleased to provide more background and elaborate on our comments at your convenience. If interested, please contact me at rquery@a2la.org. Submission number 5, this comes from Dwayne Carr. I noticed that vapor products are not mentioned in any of the regulations. For marijuana production facilities that extract concentrated cannabis, for vape products, do we have to abide by NRS 370 regulations? NRS 370.054 defines vapor products as means any non-combustible product containing nicotine or any other substance that employs a heating element, power source, electronic circuit, or other electronic, chemical, or mechanical means, regardless of the shape or size thereof, that can be used to produce vapor from nicotine or any other substance in a solution or other form, the use or inhalation of which simulates smoking. I was contacted by the Department of Taxation, Alcohol and Tobacco Division, stating that we had to obtain a tobacco license. Please let me know if marijuana vape products are required to have a tobacco license also, or is it covered under the cannabis regulations? Submission number 6, this comes from Mona Lisa Samuelson, representing the medical cannabis patients of Nevada. The Cannabis Compliance Board is now the 3rd regulatory body to be tasked with the responsibility to create and effect industry oversight. Medical cannabis patients have weathered the enormous battle of having been rushed through 2 entirely different state departments, each hurriedly creating new regulations in preparation for the windfall of the state's recreational marijuana sales. It forced the vulnerable medical cannabis patients into an awkward fighting stance as we desperately tried to protect consumer safety while simultaneously trying to preserve cannabis patients' rights. The written testimony, electronically submitted on 6/9/2020, addresses all the specific CCBR verbiage Nevada's medical cannabis patients most want to see revised before adoption of these regulations. And we mean to be very clear in stating that all penalties for all categories of violation should be more stringent. But we've not come to tell you how to do that part of your job. Creating the administrative and legal framework necessary to establish industry compliance is the most important task as far as we've seen, and patients earnestly believe the CCB should work it out amongst its esteemed colleagues. But the fact these regulations will make it impossible for medical cannabis patients to be granted any legislative help from the board without first retaining a lawyer and paying what is, to us, an exorbitant amount of money, that is a terrific slap in the face to the very people who've needed you most. We fought for the right things for all these years without compensation in order to help the industry prioritize its most important issues, while also tirelessly campaigning to manifest this very compliance board. Patients have done everything possible to help our community in setting things up right, because our sickest patients desperately need help, and by God, I hope you all mean to provide some. I cannot imagine how you would purposefully write regulations that clearly spell out the demise of any involvement from true patient advocates at the earliest stage of your policy development. You can all pat yourselves on the backs for having done what no other regulatory body had the lack of heart to do. You figuratively slit the throat of all medical cannabis patients by spelling out how we may not receive any of your help unless by a very limited and well-funded exception. So now, the score for us reads like this. Medical cannabis patients can no longer seek help from our legislators, and now will not be able to seek help from you per the following regulations as written. Regulation 2.025, board meetings. Request for special meeting will be granted only upon a showing of exceptional circumstances. The board may require that a person requesting a special meeting pay the cost associated with such meeting, in addition to those costs usually assessed against an applicant, license, or registrant. Regulation 4.140, declaratory orders and advisory opinions. Any applicant for licensure or licensed cannabis establishment may obtain a determination or advisory opinion from the board as to the applicability of any provision of Chapter 678A through 678D of NRS or any regulation adopted pursuant thereto by bringing a petition for a declaratory ruling before the board. No other person or entities may petition the board for a declaratory ruling. As written, the entirety of Regulation 4.145, adoption, amendment, or repeal of a regulation. Surely you're aware, honest to goodness, medical cannabis patients can absolutely not afford the fees associated with the board's $500 application fee and all the costs to pay the laws, who must also be courageous and willing to fight our battles against huge money. But before patients are officially refused all help, I hope the board takes into serious consideration exactly what the medical cannabis patients have been fighting for all these years. Consumer safety and patient protection are the only things we've wanted from any of these people. How terrible that we, the actual cannabis patients who need you most, we should be systematically rejected all help by money-interested politicians. We were then refused help from Nevada's health and tax regulators, who would all go to work in the private sector immediately after playing their part in cannabis regulation. And now for the third and final time, it seems, Nevada's medical cannabis patients are effectively being blocked from finding help to remedy an amenable process of corrective cannabis legislation. And by the exact same highly experienced industry lobbyists who've been allowed to silence the public and the medical patients after all. If earnest cannabis patients are never again to be heard by this board, let me take this last opportunity to beg for cannabis consumer safety by requesting this very slight but important and very meaningful revision to Regulation 8. Regulation 8.010, required written disclosure with each lot of usable cannabis. A cannabis cultivation facility must disclose in writing with each lot of usable cannabis provided to a cannabis sales facility all soil amendments, fertilizers, pesticides, and other crop production aids applied to the growing medium or cannabis plant included in the lot, giving the timetable to which they were applied. Nevadans who are sick and use cannabis as a matter of medicinal requirement have long prayed there would come to be a cannabis regulatory board that would care to recognize our vulnerable patients' real-life requirements. We were long ago promised medical cannabis. Yet once again, it's been clearly demonstrated in these latest rounds of cannabis regulations that there will be no inclusion in any capacity for honest, non-business interested people to find protective measures, effectively regulating a system which exclusively panders to cannabis opportunists who have the money to expanding business licensing opportunities for personal gain, while making sure the board ignores real medical cannabis patient input is what you're doing, and it means no one is going to fix what the cannabis industry lobbyists purposefully set into motion in an entirely exclusive manner because it best suits their bottom line. Go figure that Nevada's gold standard cannabis regulations meant purposefully seeing our honest medical patients undone. So you can bet we're mad, and we want you to know it. Submission 7 comes from Kira Sears with Joey Gilbert Law. Greetings. This board receives its authority to promulgate regulations from various provisions in Title 56 of the Nevada Revised Statutes, and unfortunately, These proposed regulations are inconsistent with such provisions, and if adopted, will be done so in excess of authority granted to the Board and in violation of the doctrine of separation of powers. The Board must extensively amend and/or withdraw altogether the proposed regulations and set forth new regulations that are lawful, consistent with their enacting and authorizing statutes, and not unreasonably impracticable. That is, where the measures necessary to comply with the law or regulation require such a high investment of risk, money, time, or any other resource or asset that the operation of a cannabis establishment is not worthy of being carried out and practiced by a reasonably prudent business person. Pursuant to NRS 678A.460, as an interested party and also as an authorized representative of other interested parties, I hereby present the following statements, arguments, and contentions in writing, which this Board is mandated to consider before adopting the proposed regulations. If the Board adopts the proposed regulations as is, the Board will exceed its grant of authority and broaden its scope of power in direct violation of various statutory and constitutional provisions. A substantial proportion of the provisions contained in proposed regulations 1 through 12 are unlawful, and if adopted, will be invalidated and repealed to include, but not limited to, regulations 1.095, 1.145, 2.020, 2.055, 2.065, Regulation 4 in its entirety, but specifically 4.035 and 4.010, and also 5.115, 6.015, 6.025, and 6.040. Let this letter shall serve as notice to the Board and Commission that these regulations are not lawful, and if adopted, will be invalidated and/or repealed. The Cannabis Compliance Board is an administrative agency under the direction of the executive branch, whose role it is to execute the laws, not make them. The provisions contained in the proposed regulations expand the power of this Board in violation of its authorizing statutes. The statutory provisions of Title 56 of NRS already prescribe the prohibited acts, violations, and penalties that pertain to the licensing and commercial production of cannabis, and the Board is not authorized to further expand those acts, violations, or penalties. The Board is authorized to promulgate regulations which carry out their statutory provisions through procedural guidelines and rules to follow. They are not meant to expand them in substance. The qualifications and requirements of licensees and agents are likewise prescribed and can also not be expanded as the Board has done here. I hereby request the Board amend the proposed regulations to conform with its statutory grant of authority and to work with the Legislative Council to ensure such compliance. All cannabis establishments and cannabis established agents must therefore be licensed, controlled, and assisted to protect the public health, safety, morals, good order, and general welfare of the inhabitants of the state, to foster the stability and success of the cannabis industry, and to preserve the competitive economy and policies of free competition of the state of Nevada. This is the spirit of the law that was passed by the people of this state, yet the proposed regulations directly hinder such creative economy and free competition. This letter shall serve as notice to the Board so that it may work directly with legislators and the Legislative Council Bureau to amend the proposed regulations and secure a determination that it may move forward. The absence of such action shall be hereto noted, and the Board shall be held accountable through the exhaustion of all administrative, legislative, and judicial remedies available. Submission 8 comes from Will Adler, Principal, Silver State Government Relations. Please accept the following summary of the detailed comments that were submitted on June 9th, 2020, making multiple recommendations to Sections 4, 6, and 11 of NCCR regulations. Section 11, Cannabis Testing Laboratories, publication of seed-to-sale tracking data. Change may to shall regarding posting metric data and COAs in NCCR 11.070, subsection 13. The Board shall publish in digital format compatible with statistical analysis on their website all certificates of analysis issued to them in the preceding month on the 1st of each month. Retesting. It is the opinion of SES that no retest ever invalidates a previously failed quality assurance test, and that all test results are valid even if retested differently. Regulation 11.075 should be rewritten to include a new subsection 7. The cannabis testing facility selected to perform the retest shall contact the cannabis cultivation or production facility to arrange the collection of a new sample for testing. Upon arrival at the cultivation or production facility, the cannabis testing facility selected to perform the retest will be shown into the facility and escorted to the lot or batch that they are retesting. The cannabis testing facility selected to perform the retest will sample from the previously failed lot using their full sampling and homogeneity protocols. Is that right, Kira?
Mm-hmm.
The cannabis testing facility selected to perform the retest will collect the new sample prior to obtaining the previously retained sample on site. The initially retained sample and the newly collected sample will be packaged in unique packaging and identified respectively. The cannabis testing facility selected to perform the retest will then test the previously retained and the newly collected sample using its standard testing protocols. The board will consider the average score from each test performed to determine whether the sample will be declared safe for sale. If the average score of the 3 tests performed is below the limit the quality assurance test previously failed, the test will then be declared safe and safe for sale. Proficiency testing, NCCR 11.040 subsection 8. Successful participation includes an acceptable score for 85% of analyte that the cannabis testing facility reports to include quantitative results when applicable. An acceptable score of 75% or greater, but less than 85% will require corrective action, but not a full retesting of the lab's proficiency. Random laboratory assurance tests, 11.085, as presented, should be replaced in its entirety with regulations that create a functional system of random laboratory assurance checks. A functional RLAC shall randomly audit every cannabis lab in the state 4 times per year. The board shall send agents to each laboratory unannounced. Those agents will select at least 5 retained samples of products already submitted to the seed to sale tracking system with final certificates of analysis. With the board investigators present, the cannabis laboratory will run a retest, including all quality assurance and cannabinoid tests on the board selected retained samples of a product. The results of the retest must have 80% of the retest producing results within 20% of the original test result. All quality assurance test results shall be the same as originally submitted on the COA. Any laboratory that fails the RLAC audit shall be classified as having submitted intentionally false statements. 2 failed RLACs within 24 months shall qualify as a Category 1 violation and may be accompanied by the revocation of the laboratory's license. Section 4, disciplinary and other proceedings before the board. Criminality, past disciplinary actions need to be maintained. 4.010, applicability. NCCR 4 shall apply to disciplinary proceedings governed by NRS 678A 500 to 678A 640. Unless otherwise ordered by the chair, this regulation shall apply to all such proceedings that are pending on the effective date of this regulation. All previously accrued penalties, categories 1 through 5, assigned by the Marijuana Enforcement Division, will remain with the license the violation was assigned to and will be regarded as a previous penalty if any subsequent violations occur in the next 3 years. Section 6, production and distribution of cannabis, security measures, NCCR 6.085, subsection 6 and 7. This section of the regulation should be modified to exclude laboratories to reflect the reality that laboratories do not have the same risks as the rest of the cannabis market. Laboratories are not targeted for robberies as they carry very small amounts of marijuana product and rarely have any cash on site. In addition, laboratories should be exempt from all additional security requirements in reference to security managers and on-site security personnel. All right, submission number 9. This comes by way of the Cannabis Equity and Inclusion Community, CEIC. Dear CCB members, thank you for the opportunity to review and provide comment on the proposed state of Nevada regulations for cannabis. CEIC&V, the Cannabis Equity and Inclusion Coalition, focuses on ensuring the cannabis industry in Nevada is inclusive of people whom were disenfranchised by the war on drugs. We believe we are the only organization in the state that can assist the CCB in advisory capacity as it relates to inclusion and community engagement with those communities that were most harmed by the war on drugs. CEIC appreciates this opportunity to assist the board as it develops a new regulation for the cannabis industry. We look forward to assisting the board as it develops rules to address the issues in the cannabis industry. CEIC respectfully submits the following comments. We look forward to the CCB adhering to the following Bill AB 533, Section 64. The board may adopt regulations necessary or convenient to carry out the provisions of this title. Such regulations may include, without limitation, financial requirements for licensees, establishing such investigative and enforcement mechanisms as the board deems necessary to ensure the compliance of a license or registrant with the provisions of this title. C, requirements for licensees or registrants relating to the cultivation, processing, manufacture, transport, distribution, testing, study, advertising, and sale of cannabis and cannabis products. D, policies and procedures to ensure that the cannabis industry in this state is economically competitive, inclusive of racial minorities, women, and persons and communities that have been adversely affected by cannabis prohibition and accessible to persons of low income seeking to start a business. E, policies and procedures governing the circumstances under which the board may waive the requirement to obtain a registration card pursuant to this title for any person who holds an ownership interest of less than 5% in any one cannabis establishment or an ownership interest in more than one cannabis establishment of the same type that, when added together, is less than 5%. F, reasonable restrictions on the signage, marketing, display, and advertising of cannabis establishments. Such a restriction must not require a cannabis establishment to obtain the approval of the board before using a logo, sign, or advertisement. G, provisions governing the sale of products and commodities made from industrial hemp, as defined in NRS 557.160, or containing cannabis oil by cannabis establishments. 2, the board shall adopt regulations providing for the gathering and maintenance of comprehensive demographic information, including without limitation information regarding race, ethnicity, age, and gender concerning each A, owner and manager of a cannabis establishment, B, holder of a cannabis establishment agent registration card. 3, the board shall transmit the information gathered and maintained pursuant to subsection 2 to the Director of the Legislative Council Bureau for transmission to the legislature on or before January 1st of each odd-numbered year. 4, the board shall, by regulation, establish a pilot program for identifying opportunities for an emerging small cannabis business to participate in the cannabis industry. As used in the subsection, emerging small cannabis business means a cannabis-related business that A, is in existence, operational and operated for a profit, B, maintains its principal place of business in this state, and satisfies requirements for the number of employees and annual gross revenue established by the board by regulation. And submission 10. This comes from Laura Jacobson with McDonald Carano. To the Honorable Chair Douglas and Director Klimas, we write now to submit additional written comments with respect to the proposed Nevada Cannabis Compliance Regulations published by the Cannabis Compliance Board on May 29, 2020, in advance of the June 18, 2020 CCB regulatory workshop. These comments are submitted with a reservation of rights to submit further additional or different comments as the proposed NCCR progresses through the rulemaking process. We welcome the opportunity to provide further information or clarification that the board may request. NCCR 6.087, subsection 2B4, we appreciate the board requiring those who work in the industry and handle cannabis to possess valid agent cards. However, as written, this provision reaches an entire host of individuals that may or may not ever enter a cannabis establishment or handle cannabis. For example, this provision would require any person who provides services such as an accountant, a custodian, or an attorney to procure an agent card prior to providing those services to a cannabis establishment. For that reason, we respectfully request that the board narrow or strike this provision such that not every person who enters into a contract with a cannabis establishment to provide services to that cannabis establishment be required to register as an agent and obtain an agent card. With respect to subpart 4, we respectfully request that this provision specify an appropriate email address to which an establishment may remit written notice of a change in status. This will aid the industry in complying with notice requirements. NCCR 6.085, subsection 1A, 6, 7, please consider exempting cannabis testing facilities, which are materially different from every other type of cannabis establishment with respect to their operations, as well as the amount of product or cash they may have on premises, from some of the requirements of this proposed regulation. Specifically, with respect to subpart 1A, please consider allowing testing facilities to have more than one entrance. In addition, please consider exempting testing facilities from employing a security manager or director and or the specific training requirements as set forth in subparts 6 and 7. NCCR 11.0102, we believe this subpart and its predecessor, NAC 453A.6502, sets forth adequate qualifications for a scientific director of a cannabis testing facility, striking the appropriate balance between academic achievement and real-world laboratory experience. Limiting the pool of potential scientific directors to only those individuals who have obtained a doctorate degree may render it impossibly difficult to obtain and qualify an appropriate number of laboratories in the state of Nevada, and will work at cross purposes with other goals to limit monopoly and promote diversity within the industry. However, if the board is inclined to adjust these requirements as urged by some commentators, it should similarly adjust the requirements of those board agents and or third parties who may audit, monitor, and inspect the scientific work of testing facilities and their directors. In CCR 11.025, subsection 3.5, we request clarification that the cost of third-party inspection and or monitoring shall not be borne by the testing facility. NCCR 11.050, subsection 5, this provision appropriately places the onus upon the submitting establishment with respect to the timing of harvesting and further processing. Please clarify that a testing facility may rely upon the representation of the submitting facility that the cannabis has been provided within 2 hours of harvest and has not undergone any further processing before being weighed. In CCR 11.075, we support the retesting procedure set forth in this regulation, which has a proven track record under NAC 453A.672. It strikes the appropriate balance between ensuring that cannabis and cannabis products are safe for consumption, while also ensuring that an entire lot of product is not destroyed unless and until a failed test is confirmed. Thank you for your time and your consideration. And that concludes the public comment period. Any questions from board members or the chair before I move on?
Questions from the chair?
Great. So we will move on to agenda item number 2, which goes over the regulations 1 through 15. So I'll deliver a brief summary of each regulation, include any changes made as a result of comments and public input received during the informal public input period. I will also briefly describe any changes of note or departures from the previous regulations of NAC 453A and D, which served as a baseline for the initial draft of the NCCR being discussed today. Now, before I get started, I'd like to provide a brief overview of the NCCR draft and discuss the process we went through to get to this point. The draft NCCR regulations 1 through 15 represent what will be the regulatory framework used by the Cannabis Compliance Board to regulate the cannabis industry in Nevada. These regulations will serve as our baseline and will allow us to begin developing this agency into the gold standard of cannabis regulation, the charge given to us by Governor Sisolak. The regulations being discussed today should not be so unfamiliar to the industry or the public. Many of these come directly from NAC 453A and D, the administrative code that the industry is currently regulated under. However, there are a number of changes and additions made to provide the appropriate tools for the CCB to begin regulating this industry more appropriately, more effectively, and much more efficiently. In an effort for transparency, the CCB released the initial draft of these regulations to the public on May 29th and solicited public input over a 12-day period. During that time, we received over 40 comments totaling over 100 pages of input. All input received was and remains posted online for the public to access. We have thoroughly reviewed and considered all the input received. Where appropriate, we have made changes and additions to the regulations based on that input. It is also important to note that these regulations are not being adopted today. This is a public workshop designed to receive additional feedback and input. The board is here to listen to this information and input so that they can make informed decisions and or additional changes as they see necessary. So with that, I will begin a brief summary of each regulation and provide for any questions from board members during and after each section. With me today to help answer any questions are Michael Miles, Deputy Director of the Cannabis Compliance Board, Steve Gilbert, who oversees licensing and registrations, Kara Cronkite, who oversees audits and inspections, and Dave Staley, who oversees investigations. This group, along with CCB staff and our legal counsel, Ashley Balducci and Chris Rath from the Attorney General's office, were instrumental in putting this document together, and I sincerely appreciate everyone's hard work on this. Following this workshop, and after considering any additional comments and input, we will finalize the regulations with any further changes that may be needed. Then CCB will notice its inaugural board meeting where the adoption of the NCCR will be included for action on the agenda. So with that, unless the chairman has any additional comments, I will begin the summaries on the regulations. Jim?
Only additional comment, this is Chair Douglas for the record. The information we provided this morning.
I can't hear anything. Sorry, can you speak up, please?
Court report.
This is Chair Douglas. We appreciate the comments that were read in the record this morning. Some of them were different from what was previously received, and some of the points that were raised were very interesting, and we will look at them. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, moving on. Regulation 1, which is the issuance of regulations, construction, definitions. Regulation 1 names and designates NCCR as the regulations issued pursuant to the regulation of cannabis in accordance with the procedures prescribed by NRS 678A, 678B, 678C, and 678D. Regulation 1 also lists the words and terms defined in NRS 678A.020. Changes and clarifications as a result of public input include section 1.125, this is on page 14, the clarification of the definition of lot, including the addition of grams as a unit of measurement. In section 1.155, on pages 14 and 15, an allowed delta of plus or minus 4 degrees of temperature when measuring pH level. In section 1.195, on page 16, clarification that public transportation does not include a taxi cab pursuant to NRS 678.430. Additions of note made outside of public input include section 1.137 on page 14. This is the definition of person. This definition, it broadens the definition of person to allow for the CCB to background check not only the individual, but also the entity applying for the license where appropriate. It also clarifies our position that an entity can be issued a work card as an independent contractor, and the reason for that is to help deal with management contracts. Lastly, in Regulation 1, Section 1.235 on page 17 defines vending machines. Any questions from board members on Regulation 1? Okay, moving on, Regulation 2, Cannabis Compliance Board, Organization and Administration. Regulation 2 outlines the organization and administration of the Cannabis Compliance Board, including powers and authority granted to the chair of the CCB, mechanics of board meetings, requirements of licensees and their representatives during a hearing or board action, servicing of notices and subpoenas, and procedure for control of evidence. This regulation is fairly straightforward. It serves to describe the process for board meetings and certain delegations. There were no changes made to our original draft of this regulation as a result of any public input. Any questions from board members on Regulation 2?
No.
Okay. Moving on to Regulation 3, this is the Cannabis Advisory Commission, Organization and Administration. Regulation 3 outlines the organization and administration of the Cannabis Advisory Commission. Again, this regulation is fairly straightforward as it sits now, but we do expect future discussions surrounding Regulation 3 once the Advisory Commission is fully appointed and operational. As board members and the public are aware, this commission will include 8 members of the public and industry appointed by the governor. Any question from board members on Regulation 3?
No.
Okay. Moving on to Regulation 4, disciplinary and other proceedings before the board. Regulation 4 outlines grounds for disciplinary action, lays out penalties for violations, describes imminent health hazards, explains the complaint and hearing process, creates a procedure for persons to request declaratory orders and advisory opinions, and creates a process for persons to request a change to the regulations. Changes to this regulation, based on public input, included an amendment to provide means to request an advisory opinion from the CCB. This change is reflected in Section 4.140, page 33 of Regulation 4. Now, revisions made internally to Regulation 4 include 4.035 through 4.060, found on pages 21 through 26. The language was changed to update the amount of civil penalties assigned based on a detailed list of violations. This includes a significant increase to fines across all civil penalty categories. In addition, increased category designations were given to a number of specific violations. Furthermore, the time between violations to compute progressive discipline was increased from 2 years to 3 years. In 4.070 through 4.135, it'll be found on pages 27 to 33. These sections were created to detail the disciplinary hearing process. This process clarifies the appointment, if deemed necessary by the board, of a hearing officer to render a decision. However, the board still remains the final arbiter of discipline. 4.145, found on page 34. This was created so an interested party may petition the board for a change in regulations. Any questions from board members on Regulation 4?
No.
Okay. Moving on to Regulation 5, licensing, background checks, and registration cards. Regulation 5 includes the most comprehensive changes as compared to the current regulations, NAC 453A and B. Regulation 5 provides a more expansive and comprehensive licensing and approval structure for cannabis companies, owners, and employees, and generally replaces and augments the provisions of NAC 453D.250 through NAC 453D.365. Regulation 5.0 on page 35. This is the application process. This is new and helps establish that a cannabis license is a privileged license, providing notification that such license is not guaranteed and placing the burden on the applicant to prove that they are suitable, not placing the burden on the CCB to prove that they are unsuitable. This Regulation 5.0 is similar to the contents of the Gaming Control Board's Regulation 4. Much of the licensing and inspection covered by Regulations 5.010 through 5.090. This is found on pages 36 through 42. These mimic the prior requirements of NAC 453D while giving CCB agents more power to inspect locations and request information to conduct investigations, while also broadening the qualifications for licensure to be evaluated by the CCB. Regulation 5.095, this is found on page 42. This is the renewal of license, which replaces NAC 453D.305. This has been drastically revised so that a license renewals will be reduced to primarily renewal fee payment instead of a significant submission and review of licensee information. The various items to be reviewed under NAC 453D.305 have either been eliminated or shifted so that they are reviewed during routine audits or cannabis establishment agent card renewals. This change freed up significant full-time employee hours with associated cost savings and simplified renewals for licensees. Previously, most renewal applications needed to be processed during May and June rather than being spread out equally during the year. Regulations 5.110 and 5.115, found on pages 43 to 46. These clarify the types of transactions and organizations that the CCB regulates and extends regulation to entities or individuals that gain significant control over or receive a percentage of profits from licensees through agreements, financing, or other means. These provisions were not originally included in NAC 453D. Moving to regulations 5.120 through 5.150, pages 46 through 52. These enhance the cannabis agent registration card process and clarify licensing of owners, officers, and board members, while providing a mechanism for companies to request a waiver of the licensing process for owners of less than 5% that do not exert control over the licensee. The inability to waive licensing of less than 5% shareholders has been a significant impediment to the participation of publicly traded companies in the Nevada cannabis industry. Additionally, we received a number of comments surrounding the 5% threshold, and we feel that this waiver process allows the board the necessary discretion to act in the state's best interest during the licensing process. Regulation 5.135, this is found on page 51. This is submission of applications electronically. Codifies a process that the agency recently put in place to eliminate a significant amount of paper application processing and manual payment acceptance. Another enhancement that freed up significant full-time employee hours with significant associated cost savings and efficiencies. Any questions from board members on Regulation 5?
Mr. Chair Douglas, note as to the 5% and less than 5%, we will have some ongoing discussions about that issue. There are some concerns as to our ability to waive certain requirements because of the mandatory nature of the NRS as to ownership requirements, as to age, prior denials, or other things. So it's something that we understand the concern of the industry, but we are mindful at this point because of the prior legislation, there's some inconsistencies with that area and the concern of publicly traded companies. And that's something that may be suitable for address to the legislature next session.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Tyler, this is Dennis.
Yes, Member Nylander.
Yes, and Mr. Chairman, if I might just make a comment.
Please.
Yeah, so just overall, in respect of Regulation 5, it is consistent with part of our charge, which was to try to mimic the gaming regulations to the extent it made sense for this particular area. And Regulation 5, in my view, does that. It is consistent, and I wanted to just acknowledge the drafters and thank them for the way they drafted this. It's done very well. And going back to Regulation 4, the deck relief provisions and the advisory opinion provisions, I think, are actually better than what exists in the gaming regulations now. So that's just a brief comment. I wanted to couple those together before we moved on so I can go back on mute.
Great. Thank you, Member Nylander.
Thank you.
There's no other questions. Continue to Regulation 6. Regulation 6 is the production and distribution of cannabis. Regulation 6 outlines cannabis possession limits for patients and adult use consumers, requirements if an establishment has changes in operations, written requests to change location, standard operating procedures, inventory control systems, outdoor cultivation requirements, cleanliness and health of agents, and restrictions on advertising. We received a number of comments around Regulation 6, including the request for the addition to include weight in grams, where previously the weight was listed in only ounces. This change is reflected in Section 6 and other sections of the NCCR. Other revisions made, both internally and as a result of public input, include 6.010, that's subsection 1D and 2D. That's found on page 54 and 55. Language was added to include a combination of usable and concentrated cannabis not to exceed the legal limit. 6.065, subsection 2F, page 58. Language was added to include, if establishment is operational, a detailed inventory report and plan to transfer inventory to a new location. This is in relation to a transfer of location for an operational establishment. 6.070, subsection 7, this is found on page 59. Language was added to allow for patrol dogs and service animals to be on site at cannabis facilities. Also, based on public comment, we added the language, nothing in this section shall be construed to supersede or be in conflict with the Americans with Disability Act. 6.080, this is found on page 60 to 63. Language was added to help clarify independent laboratories are not included in the requirements to establish and implement an inventory control system as defined in 6.080, and independent testing laboratories do not need to supply consumer education and support. 6.085, subsection 1(3), Roman numeral 6, is found on page 64. Language was added to include methods of providing stored video footage to the CCB on portable, external hard drives, or other media at the expense of the cannabis establishment and within a reasonable time frame as determined by the CCB. The word video was removed from video printer in 3, Roman numeral 2. In 6.123, this is on page 71, language was removed requiring name, logo, sign, and advertising needing pre-approval from the board. In 6.135, also found on page 71, the board received numerous public comment requests to extend the due date for quarterly reports required. Therefore, the language was amended here in 6.135 and now makes the requirement for quarterly reports due on the 30th day of January, April, July, and October. Do you have any questions from board members on Regulation 6? Okay. Moving on to Regulation 7, Cannabis Sales Facility. This section outlines the requirements for cannabis sales facilities operations, duties of agents before sale to consumer, group of age, sales limits, restrictions on sales, advertising, storage, sources, and delivery requirements. Major revisions to this section include 7.030, subsection 8, found on page 73. This places a duty on cannabis sales facilities to not recommend products to women that are pregnant or breastfeeding. Public comment was received and accepted on Regulation 7.050, subsection 9, on pages 76 and 77. The time frame to report a vehicle accident was increased from 2 hours to 12 hours. A couple other things I'd like to note on Regulation 7. We received a handful of comments from industry expressing a desire to continue and to have the regulations allow for curbside delivery, which, as you know, is something that the CCB implemented as a result of COVID-19 and in the interest of public health and safety. Although it's not reflected in this draft of the regulation, curbside pickup does remain in effect for the time being. And this is something that the CCB can address at a future meeting or workshop if they so choose. Additionally, there were a few comments on drive-throughs as well, and to clarify, and this is during normal operating circumstances, so outside of emergency directives, which we're currently operating under now. Under normal operating circumstances, drive-throughs are allowed, and that is through a submission of a facility modification, which licensees must submit first. So just to clarify that. A couple other clarifying points. We did receive requests to allow for GPS tracking in delivery vehicles. That would be in place of the pre-printed delivery routes. I think it's something that we should continue to discuss as we move forward so we can decrease any kind of potential for internal theft. But for this reason, we won't be increasing the 5-ounce transportation limit at this time, as we do receive several reports of theft during consumer deliveries. And that's what we had for Regulation 7 on the public comment. Any questions from board members on Regulation 7?
No.
Great. Moving on to Regulation 8, cannabis cultivation facility. This section outlines the requirements for cannabis cultivation facilities, including operations, samples, excise taxes, access, and storage. We did not receive any comments. This is a short regulation, and there are no major revisions to this section. Any questions from board members on Regulation 8?
No. No.
Okay. Regulation 9, this is the production of cannabis products. This section outlines the requirements for production facilities, including hand and arm contact with products, qualifications, extraction, training, use of ingredients, sanitation, temperature control, shelf life, testing, sinks, equipment, and ventilation. Major revisions to this section include 9.015 subsection 2. This is found on page 80. A certified food protection manager now must be available on site during all operating hours. 9.025 subsection 4. It's on page 81. New menu items which require a HACCP plan. This is and Kara, please correct me if I'm wrong, this is a hazard analysis and a food safety monitoring system. This plan must be approved by a processing authority prior to submission. We received public comment regarding the shelf life of certain products. Wanted to add a little to that. We currently send out shelf life guidance. We feel the science changes quite often, so we recommend that board agents remain the authority on the shelf life guidance, and that that kind of guidance is issued through regular and updated listserv announcements to the industry. Any questions from board members on Regulation 9? Right. Regulation 10, minimum good manufacturing practices for cultivation and preparation of cannabis and cannabis products for administration to humans. This section outlines the requirements for minimum good manufacturing practices, which is a federally recognized standard, including quality control, ventilation and filtration, labeling and packaging, standard operating procedures, maintenance of equipment, hygiene, salvage of products, records, building requirements, water, plumbing, lighting, pesticides application, and waste. With Regulation 10, we did not have any major revisions to this section as compared to the current regulations of 453A-D. We did receive some public input, however, requesting consistent use of centimeters and inches. So section 10.035 on page 89, that was revised to include both of those. Any questions from board members on Regulation 10?
No.
No.
Moving on to Regulation 11, cannabis testing facilities. This section outlines the requirements for cannabis testing facilities, including qualifications, accreditation, general laboratory standards and practices, chain of custody, records, proficiency testing, research and development, quality assurance, required tests, homogeneity, I said that right?
Yes.
Pesticides, sampling, certificates of analysis, and retesting. This regulation also contains a number of changes and variances from previous regulations in order to address some of the recent lab issues that this state has faced in the cannabis industry. To go through a few of those, major revisions include, starting with 11.010, subsection 6, found on page 94. The scientific director must be on the premises of the testing facility at least 5 work days each month. On 11.025, subsection 7, found on page 96, all quality assurance tests shall be validated or verified by the cannabis testing facility observing the guidelines of the most recent version of standard ASTM D8282. This is the standard for validating methods. Standard practice for laboratory test method validation and method development, or any subsequent standard as approved by the appropriate board agent. 11.040, subsection 8, can be found on page 98. Proficiency tests must be completed with an acceptable range for all the target analytes that the cannabis testing facility reports, to include quantitative results when applicable. The proficiency testing company will determine what the acceptable range is. On 11.050, this is subsection 4, found on page 103. The analytical portion that is used for the purposes of any microbial test must be a minimum of 1 gram, unless otherwise approved by the board. On 11.050, staying there with subsection 8, also on page 103, the certificate of analysis shall include a photo of the product as received. 11.070, subsection 5, this is found on page 105. Cannabis testing facility shall keep any sample which fails testing or which is collected by the board for confirmation testing for 30 days after failure or collection. And 11.075, this is subsection 1, found on page 107. A lot or production run of cannabis that failed a residual solvents, pH, AW, homogeneity, or microbial screening test may be used to make an extract if approved by the board agent on a case-by-case basis. So we received several comments regarding regulations 11.040A, that's back on 97, which we discussed. This regulation discusses accuracy and passing scores. The verbiage was revised to state that a passing score will be determined by the proficiency testing company. The independent testing lab, it has to receive a passing score on all target analytes. Any failed tests must be repeated within 30 days or is otherwise approved by the appropriate board agent. Per request, regulation 11.050 subsection 3, it's on page 103. Sorry, we're going back here. Was revised to include a lower limit of at least 5 grams of a sample size for any production run. It was also requested that alpha terpenoline, great.
That's enough.
Great. Kara Cronkite is our lab expert here. Be revised to the common term, Kara?
Terpenoline.
Which was accepted in regulation 11.055, page 103, 104. A request to revise Regulation 11.070, subsection 1D, that's on page 105. That was accepted to require the seed to sale tracking document, such as a metric tag, be attached to the sample package. Also added on page 105, I believe page 105, excuse me, 106, was subsection 13. Now this allows the board to publish all certificates of analysis on the CCB website. If approved, this addition is something that will certainly help increase transparency in the industry and on behalf of the CCB. Regulation 11.075, this is found on page 107, was revised to spell out water activity rather than just the abbreviation AW. A couple other comments on 11. We received questions regarding pathogenic E. coli tests, and this is something that we will be looking into and likely communicating to the labs via our industry guidance and listserv. We also received a request to add chromium and nickel to the heavy metals test. This is also something that we plan on looking into for future revisions. Any questions from board members on Regulation 11?
No.
Okay. Moving on to Regulation 12, packaging and labeling of cannabis products. Regulation 12 outlines the requirements for packaging and labeling of cannabis products, including stamp or mold requirements, labeling, product disclosures, and warnings. The board received numerous public comment requests to allow for an extended period of time for cannabis establishments to work through existing packaging before we change the wording for the warning requirements outlined in Regulation 12. So we didn't update the regulation language to give that time frame, but pending, of course, board approval, we would certainly support issuing industry guidance that allows for a 12-month work-through period for existing packaging as that transition happens. And we hope that that will help, or certainly help, with the switch over to the new requirements. Some of the other revisions to Regulation 12, in 12.015, that's subsection 2 on page 109, and there's quite a few small changes in here, so we'll start with 12.015, subsection 2, page 109. Language was added to include cannabis or cannabis products must be packaged in opaque, child-resistant packaging in accordance with 16 CFR Part 1700. 12.030, subsection 1J, on page 110. We changed the language on the label requirements to state, this product contains cannabis. This section is for cannabis cultivation facilities and their products. Also, 12.030, subsection 1K, also on page 110, we added language for cannabis product labels to include the warning, keep out of reach of children on labels. This section is for cannabis cultivation facilities and their products. 12.030, subsection 2, also on page 110, the sample label now includes an example of the proper warning on labels to include this product contains cannabis and keep out of reach of children. This section is for cannabis cultivation facilities and their products. 12.035, subsection 1O, that's page 112. We changed the warning language to be this product contains cannabis. This section is for cannabis production facilities and their products. 12.035, subsection 2. Also on page 112, the sample label now includes an example of the proper warning on labels to include this product contains cannabis. Again, this section is for production facilities and their products. On 12.035, subsection 1O, page 112, We added language if the product is an edible cannabis product other than extracts and tinctures, the serving size. So this is to help clarify that extracts and tinctures do not need to list the serving size on the label. 12.040 subsection 1K is found on page 113. We changed the language again on the label requirements to state this product contains cannabis. This section is for cannabis sales facility in their products. In the same vein, 12.040 subsection 1K, we added the language for cannabis product labels to include the warning, keep out of reach of children on those labels. Again, this section is for the cannabis sales facility and usable cannabis products. 12.040 subsection 2 just holds the sample label that gives an example of the proper warning on the labels. 12.045 subsection 1S on page 114, again, changed language to this product contains cannabis for sales facility and cannabis products. 12.045 subsection 2 on 114 just gives a sample label with the updated language. Any questions from board members on Regulation 12? Okay. Moving to Regulation 13, this is cannabis distributors. Regulation 13 outlines the requirements for cannabis distributors, including duties of the distributor, storage of cannabis and cannabis products, distribution amounts, and multiple deliveries. Revisions include, in 13.010 subsection 3, page 116, revise the language to state a cannabis distributor shall not deliver cannabis or cannabis products to a consumer under their distribution license. 13.030 subsection 8, page 121, we added a new subsection, subsection 8. Before using a motor vehicle to transport cannabis or cannabis products, a cannabis testing facility must obtain the approval of the appropriate board agent for the use of the motor vehicle. Upon approving a motor vehicle for use to transport cannabis or cannabis products, the board will issue an identification card containing such information as the board agent determines to be necessary, which must be kept inside the motor vehicle at all times. Any vehicle used by an independent testing laboratory for sample pickup must now be inspected and approved by a board agent. Any questions for board members on Regulation 13?
No.
Okay. Moving to Regulation 14. This is registry identification cards, letters of approval, designated primary caregiver, and petition for qualification of disease or condition as chronic or debilitating medical condition. Regulation 14 outlines the requirements for patients to apply for, receive, and renew a registry identification card. Letter of approval or designated primary caregiver also includes process to petition the division, which is with Department of Health and Human Services, for a disease or condition to be added to the qualifying conditions. So, to add context here, this regulation pertains mainly to the Department of Health and Human Services and comes largely intact from NAC 453. We had no major revisions to this. So that brings us to the final regulation. Well, unless the board have any questions on Regulation 14.
No questions here?
Okay.
No questions here.
Finally, Regulation 15, this is licensee workplace requirements, and it is fairly straightforward. Regulation 15 requires cannabis establishments to create and maintain policies and procedures prohibiting discrimination and harassment in the workplace. Any questions from board members on Regulation 15?
None.
Okay. Open it one more time for board members. Any questions on any of the regulations 1 through 15?
No, not here. Not here from the chair.
Okay.
None here.
well. So that'll conclude agenda item number 2. Agenda item number 3 is the public comment period, as I stated at the beginning. Any comments that we have received since yesterday's closing period during today's meeting, we will be posting online following this meeting as the last public comment period. So we certainly encourage any members of the public, if they have an interest, to submit their public comment. Again, email that to regulations@ccb.nv.gov. So with that, we will look now to notice the first board meeting of the Cannabis Compliance Board. Hopefully you'll be joined by 2 additional members at that meeting. And we will make sure that the public and industry is aware of those notices. Mr. Chairman, if you have anything else to add before we adjourn?
We are at a stage where we have a new beginning. The regulations that were read today have not been adopted. They will be put forth at the first meeting for formal adoption. Additional input will be received at that time, if any. We will consider some of the things that have been added by the late or the new submissions today, as well as some of the other things that we're trying to work through. This is not the end, it's just the beginning. Some of the things that were pointed out by the industry, we are concerned with also, and trying to figure out suitable means to adapt them so that we follow the requirements that were put forth by the legislature in enacting the governance and guidance for the cannabis industry. That's it.
Great. Well, thanks everyone, and with that, we'll adjourn this workshop and see you again at the first meeting of the Cannabis Compliance Board. Thank you.
Thank you.